joining us on Sunday morning for Treaties, Constitutions, and Arranged Relations. So this is broadly going to be about the complex interplay between law and empire, and we have three terrific panelists to help guide us this morning. We're going to go in roughly chronological order, so what I'm going to do is I'll introduce the panelists. Well, I know not everyone has a copy of the program, so you know their bio. So I'll introduce them right before they speak, and then I think if you have questions right after for the speaker, then please go ahead and ask, and then we'll have a broader conversation at the end. So our first speaker this morning is Lance Collins, who's an attorney and a per diem district and family court judge in Maui. He holds a PhD from the University of Hawaii and serves as the executive director of the Hawaii Institute for Philippine Studies. He publishes primarily on the legal histories of the Philippines and Hawaii. And he edits the long-running series of books, which is a terrific series on West Maui history and culture, and has produced 2 Hawaiian-Filipino musical albums known as Havili. Lance.
All right. Aloha. Good morning.
Aloha.
Okay, so this is sort of an ambiguous instruction from Tom Kaufman, who invited me to participate. And he said to keep it short, which is hard for me to do, but I will try to keep it short. My big concern with legal histories of Hawaii and the Philippines has to do with trying to both unpack American nationalism as thoughtways in how we think about legal histories, but also resisting the kinds of native nationalisms that produce basically a national bourgeoisie that Fanon talks about in Wretched of the Earth. And so consequently, most people don't like what I have to say. I had a law professor in the Philippines that almost got into a fist fight with me, except I don't fight, so wouldn't have actually been fighting, this would have been me getting beaten. But it does happen. And so I mention all of that because that's the direction that I come from with this. So just one small example of why I think this is important, particularly for Hawaii historiography with respect to legal history. An article that I wrote called Approaching the State, How to Read the Malolo's Constitution, unpacks how American colonial officials basically introduced a whole bunch of concepts of American constitutionalism into the Malolo's Constitution, which was written and executed before there was any American constitutionalism in Philippine elite thought. And so actually, if you read the Malolo's Constitution from the perspective of being an interlocutor of Hispanic constitutionalism of the 19th century, you get a very different result of what the Malolo's Constitution meant, as opposed to using American concepts, which is how Philippine historiography looks at the Malolo's Constitution. And it's very different. And it has impacts about what is the significance of that to today. Okay, so I mention all of that because what I'm going to be talking about now is 19th century American constitutional law to consider how Hawaii was acquired by the United States under that framework and why it was a necessary step in order for the hegemony of what American constitutional law was in the 19th century had to basically shift in order to accept all of the colonies that were the result of the Spanish-American War. So without the reworking of the hegemony of American constitutional law at the end of the 19th century and Hawaiians' resistance to that or communication with Americans in that, there could not have been the receipt of all of these other colonies with people in them. So in the 19th century, the accepted wisdom of American constitutional law was, and this is from Cooley, outlying colonies are not within the contemplation of the Constitution of the United States. Outlying colonies are not within the contemplation of the Constitution of the United States. So in 1893, that was the prevailing wisdom of constitutional law in the US. So what kind of territories could be acquired by the United States? And the standards were that it had to be a contiguous landmass to the existing United States, or it had to at least be part of the North American continent, mainly of the white race, excluding Indians from that count, the consent of the inhabitants, formally or substantively, and generally the territory that was acquired would be governed by Congress until the territory was admitted as a state. So by treaty in the 19th century, with this hegemonic understanding of what are the powers of the United States with respect to acquiring territory, the Louisiana Purchase, Florida was done by treaty, California and the Southwest was by war, the Treaty of Hidalgo, Guadalupe. Oregon also was by war. Alaska was by treaty and purchase. And then there were two treaties I just want to note that were not approved by the United States. One was the Treaty of Annexation of Hawaii in the 1850s, and then the treaty to acquire the Dominican Republic. Grant proposed it to the Senate, and it was a way to basically unload free slaves out of the U.S. into this other territory, and that was also rejected. And Hawaii was rejected in part on the American side, or the delay in that happening, and then of course there was the Hawaiian side of it, there's a book about that. Had to do with the fact that Hawaii was not part of North America, and the consequences that acquiring Hawaii would have on the Monroe Doctrine, which was considered to be of constitutional significance. Santo Domingo, of course, was also not contiguous, was not mainly of the white race, even though there was supposedly the consent of the inhabitants, and so that was also down. So that was the precedent in the 19th century. So here we have in 1893, we have basically this US military taking over the legitimate government of the Hawaiian Kingdom with this sort of white minority, provisional government. And they proposed this Treaty of Annexation to the U.S. Senate, and it was going to pass. It looked like all indications looked like it was going to pass, except that constitutional scholars started coming up and saying, well, wait a second, this isn't contiguous to North America. It's not part of North America. It's not contiguous to the existing thing. Actually, the issue of the white race is very interesting because all of the constitutional scholars said, well, they're not white, but actually they were rapidly Christianized, so actually that's not really a factor because they're like quasi-white. And there's a whole, whole thing about Holland and, model minority status and white supremacy. I won't get into that, but anyways, that wasn't really a consideration. But the most important thing was the consent of the inhabitants. And so the constitutional scholar said, look, a provisional government doesn't have authority to hand over land it doesn't actually own. It doesn't have authority to consent for people who don't agree. A provisional government is only given the powers necessary to accomplish whatever was provisionally created to do. And provisionally being created to annex this landmass to the United States can never be a necessity, and so the provisional government doesn't have the sort of authority. So the main challenge in 1893 was the fact that the inhabitants of Hawaii did not agree to annexation. So eventually, time passed, the sugar barons of the U.S., the beet sugar barons basically cut it off. So what did the provisional government do to change this consent of the inhabitants? Well, they said, okay, we're going to go the route of Texas, or the route of somebody. And so they created the Republic of Hawaii, tried to get international recognition, and then submitted a treaty to the United States, which was considered by the Senate, and of course it didn't pass. But the idea was, well, with this treaty, now you have the consent of the governed. Except that American constitutional scholars continue to say, look, treaty or no treaty, this is not like Texas, because in Texas, all the white people that went to Texas basically became the majority, and then they said, well, we want to be part of the United States. Well, the majority in Hawaii still don't want it, and we have here on the walls, this is why the Ku'e petitions are so important, because this is the conversation between the Hawaiian people and the American people saying, under your understanding of your powers, we do not consent. Okay, so, but from the formal perspective, the government that was controlling the Hawaiian Islands did have a treaty, and from that side, there was a treaty that was submitted to the U.S. Senate, which of course wasn't accepted. But from this 19th century constitutional perspective, what was more important were these petitions, because you can't get around basically almost everybody in Hawaii saying we don't want to be part of the United States. And so that was an obstacle to 19th century constitutional law. Okay, well, following the path of Texas, under the admission of state power and under the war powers of Congress, they passed the resolution that purports to acquire or admit Hawaii as part of the territory of the United States, and basically disregards all of the standards that made up 19th century constitutional law on this point. There are two exceptions to everything I just said. One are the Guano Islands, which Meagan is going to talk much more about. And the Guano Islands were not considered to be within the territorial boundaries of the United States. So any acts that were committed on there were considered to be acts committed on the high seas on a ship of the United States, even though they're islands. So it's an exception to what I just said about territorial acquisition. And then the other exception, and I'll sort of end here, has to do with John Ross, who was a sailor, committed murder in Yokohama. And under the treaty with the United States, he was tried by an American consular official based upon a written complaint. He was convicted. He was sent to prison in New York. And about 10 years later, he sought habeas corpus, saying, wait, in the Bill of Rights, I have to be indicted by a grand jury. And the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, because you are not within the territorial boundaries of the United States, and so the Bill of Rights don't exactly apply in that particular context involving some treaties, but it had to do with being in or out of the territorial boundaries of the United States. And so I say all of this is important, and this is where I'll leave it for everybody else to talk about. Hawaii ended up being so important because it was basically the predicate act that was necessary to destroy the then governing hegemony of 19th century American constitutional law that could allow basically what at the time had been a minority view to become the predominant view in constitutional law that would allow the acquisition of outlying colonies that were previously not within the contemplation of the Constitution of the United States, drawing significantly on the John Ross and the Guano Act, the precedents, which were sort of exceptions to the rule. And then the only thing that I'd say is a practical matter that separates Hawaii from the rest in terms of American constitutional law, because Hawaii was sort of at the end of this 19th century way of thinking about territorial acquisition. Hawaii was considered to be an incorporated territory, was included within the territorial boundaries of the United States by Congress's acts, whereas all of these other colonies that it acquired after Hawaii were not. They were unincorporated territories. The Bill of Rights did not apply, and it was up to Congress to decide which rights in the Bill of Rights applied, whereas in Hawaii, it was considered to be part of the territory, within the territorial boundaries of the United States, and so Congress was not free to pick and choose which rights in the Bill of Rights. So, okay, anyways, I'm sorry I talked too long, but that's that.
You talk less than everybody else has talked so far.
Yeah, right.
So that was a lot. That was a very quick introduction to 19th century constitutional law. Does anyone have any immediate questions? We'll come back to a larger conversation, but immediate questions for Lance. Yes.
Did you say there was that somebody tried to acquire Hawaii in like 1815?
Yeah, there was a discussion between Kamehameha III and the U.S. government, and there was a treaty of annexation that was proposed, but when Kamehameha III died, Kamehameha IV did not continue to pursue it, and of course there were changes in the American part of it too. But whether it actually would have happened if Kamehameha III had continued to be alive, I don't think so, and that's based on what happened with Santo Domingo 20 years later, was that I don't know that, it may have been, I don't know. Actually, I really don't know, because the Guano Act did come into effect about 10 years later, so it's possible, but I think unlikely that had Kamehameha III stayed alive. I don't know that based on how people viewed what was within the bounds of the Constitution, that Hawaii could have been, that actually would have occurred in the 50s.
I don't know if you talked about it previously, because I kind of walked in a little bit late. Would you discuss doctrine of discovery in part of this?
So yeah, so under American constitutional law, doctrine of discovery, and actually the Guano Act that's under that power or that theory of a nation state's power to acquire territory. That's how the Guano Act has its founding, and most of the continental acquisitions of territory are either under the treaty-making power and or in connection with discovery, but pretty much most of the U.S.'s territorial acquisitions are not based on discovery. It's based on treaty cessation, or war, or a combination of those three. But the Guano Act, the Guano Islands are definitely fall completely within that, but as an exception and not considered to be within the territorial boundaries of the United States.
Because I was always under the belief, based on what I heard from some people, that doctrine of discovery was how the Indians lost their lands, you know, that Christian flag versus a non-Christian nation.
So Mexico's claim to the territory that eventually was taken over by the United States was based on discovery, and the original 13 states in different ways had similar, but all of the territorial acquisitions after the United States became a country were all done by treaty, cessation, or war, or a combination of those three, except for the Guano Islands. But yes, but all of that is founded. I mean, if you go back, the original claim, whoever they got it through treaty, war, or cessation, that previous controller of those lands asserted their claims based on discovery. Originally.
Next. I came in at the end and I just kind of caught the tail end of what you said. Did you bring up anything with regards to the 1980 legal opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel regarding the annexation of Hawaii in 1898?
I didn't, yeah. I'm focused, I'm leaving it to everybody else, but I'm focused only at looking at what was going on in the 1890s based on that there was a change in what the prevailing view of constitutional law was at the end of the 19th century, and how basically the taking of Hawaii, which was contrary to that predominant view, actually changed constitutional law and allowed for all of the subsequent territories that were acquired by treaty to be allowed to be constitutional, although it's worked out in the insular cases in a weird way. It was worked out, all the details were worked out later over a 20-year period, but that basically there had to be a sacrifice of the prevailing constitutional norms at the end of the 19th century with Hawaii in order to do everything that happened after. And it was just, as I said, the outlying colonies are not within the contemplation of the Constitution of the United States. That was the prevailing wisdom in the 19th century. And all of the standards of that had to be basically undone in order to accept everything. And Hawaii was the one that undid it, even in the face of the Kuwait petitions, in order to get everything that happened after. And so, yeah, Hawaii is the pivotal role that basically resolving the Hawaii question the way the United States political institutions did basically is what allowed the United States to become an empire. Because if they didn't disregard basically 120 years of precedent in constitutional law, they would not have been able to do what happened. They wouldn't have been able to resolve the Spanish-American War the way they did. They wouldn't have acquired all of these territories. They couldn't have, because they couldn't under the prevailing, but there was a shift, and Hawaii was basically the point from one epoch to the next.
So just to kind of quickly, just to explain what the 1988 legal opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel spoke to, it was now within a constitutional framework, juxtaposition of the Hawaiian Kingdom, Hawaii as a country, and constitutional law, and the effects of a joint resolution. And the reason why the Office of Legal Counsel had to draft that legal opinion was because they were asked by the State Department to determine how can the United States take advantage of the Law of the Sea Convention that would extend the territorial sea from 3 miles to 12 miles. So that's why this legal opinion done by Douglas Kamaya ended up looking into Hawaii and whether or not Congress has that authority to extend the territorial sea an additional 9 miles. And what came up, their conclusion was, the US Congress, and constitutional statutes and the Constitution itself has no effect beyond the borders of the United States. So Congress cannot extend an additional 9 miles if it is only limited to 3 miles. So the conclusion that the opinion said, it is therefore unclear which constitutional authority Congress utilized when acquiring Hawaii by a joint resolution, because there's no treaty. So now this is 1988, and that just pulled the keystone out of that bridge of annexation. But I completely agree with you, Lance, that that time when it was going on was setting the stage for empire. No, it's good. Yeah, you definitely see it.
Yeah, and maybe just one additional point to that is that, you know, because there was this shift from one way of looking at the Constitution to another, there are a whole bunch of small details that these constitutional scholars in 1893 pointed out that weren't addressed because it was just this different way of looking at things. So Palmyra, basically who actually is the legal owner of crown and government lands, all of these issues basically to this day are not actually resolved because it was like when they shifted from one way of examining this, we can't have outlying colonies, to the next, and it happened so quickly that nobody really had thought out. It's like, well, we're gonna admit Hawaii like Texas, but it's like, well, but Texas didn't have Palmyra, and like there weren't like millions of acres of government land and crown lands, and like how did the Republic get to be the one to be the owner of it? And anyways, all of those issues, basically, there were all of these things that just were not considered at all in this rush to move forward, and because the US immediately went to everywhere else, they basically remained, and the sugar plantations didn't need those questions answered while they controlled everything in the basically police state that they enacted after 1893. So all of those issues basically lay dormant until 1959, and then all of a sudden there's all these questions and nobody can answer them, and they don't know what to do, and they don't want to do anything because if they answer them, it's going to be a problem. So it's just sort of like this stagnant quagmire of an occupied state that's just persistently nothing gets done because there are all of these sort of secondary questions that can't be addressed because it wasn't part of this shift. So.
All right, thanks, Lance. So our next speaker is Joseph Foukona, who's an assistant professor of history here at UH, whose research interests focus on Pacific history, Pacific indigenous land, and of course, Pacific law systems. Is that on?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, so just by way of an introduction, I'm from the Solomons. It's in the western part of the Pacific. So it's in the sub-region known as Melanesia. I would like to begin by saying, in the 19th century, there were different political institutions, part of the local governance mechanism in the Pacific. So in some places, like the Western Pacific, we have institutions that are not centralized. All right, so the political authority is dispersed, it's vested in different tribal groups. In some parts of the Pacific, you have a highly stratified political system or governance arrangement. In Tonga, for instance, they have a monarch. Here in Hawaii, they have a monarch. In Samoa, they have a Matai system. And so these are the kinds of political structures, governance arrangements that were in place in the Pacific. Now, in the 19th century, the doctrine of sovereignty under international law was a foreign power does not have the right to assert the sovereignty over territories in other domains unless they were granted that sovereignty by effective local government. Right, so that was the existing doctrine of sovereignty during the 19th century. So the empires, when they started to move into the Pacific, they had to look at different ways of introducing legal devices in a way to extend the legal jurisdiction to places in the Pacific. All right? So in the Western Pacific, the British were of the impression that there wasn't any effective government in place because it's not centralized. They could not pinpoint who to negotiate with, to extend their jurisdiction. But in other places, you have, especially in the sub-region of Polynesia, you have highly stratified traditional legal authorities that are in place. So what the British did in the Western Pacific was they introduced a number of legal devices as a way to extend the territorial, extend the jurisdiction over islands in the Western Pacific. So one of the things they did was in 1890 they introduced what is known as the Foreign Jurisdiction Act, all right, as a way of extending British jurisdiction to places in the Western Pacific where they had the impression that there wasn't any effective government in place. Now, to give legal effect to that act, they introduced what is known as the Pacific Order in Council 1893. That was the legal instrument that was used to extend or to give teeth to the Foreign Jurisdiction Act of 1890 to assert British sovereignty over their subjects in the Western Pacific, as well as natives in the Western Pacific. So that was an example of a legal device introduced to an existing or pre-existing political structure. And that moment in time created disruption all over existing political structures, existing society, and the people as well. So the introducing of really a colonial nation state in the Western Pacific. And that is known as protectorate. Over Solomon Islands, Gilbert and Ellice, or what is known today as Kiribati and Tuvalu. For the case of Fiji, it was different. The British actually entered into a treaty with Fiji because the British had the impression that they had already an existing political structure. They were chiefs that they could negotiate with and then enter into a treaty. And that extended the British jurisdiction to Fiji by way of treaty. Now, for the case of Hawaii, it's interesting because what you have was there was already an existing nation state. All right. So the only way you can actually extend U.S. jurisdiction is either by way of a treaty, or by way of conquest, or an effective overthrow of the government, the existing government in place. And that was what happened in 1893. You have a coup. Now, to give legal effect to that action, the 1898 in a resolution, the National Resolution gave effect. That was a legal device that gave effect to the action in 1893. And to further consolidate that 1893 legal device, the introducing of the Organic Act of 1900, and that put the nail to the coffin in terms of asserting sovereignty, the United States sovereignty over Hawaii. So what you see is a disruption of an existing nation state and a gradual change that moved from an existing nation state to an incorporated territory of the United States in 1900. And then, eventually Hawaii became a state of the United States in 1959. So you can see that there's a legal engineering going on in the 1890s in the Western Pacific and also for the case of Hawaii in 1990s. But that's, so it just shows you that the existing idea of nations in the Pacific and even in Hawaii is actually an evidence of a disruption that happened in the late 19th century over existing or pre-existing political structures as well as pre-existing society. So in some places, you have the indigenous population subsequently, eventually became subsumed as part of the settled state, or the colonizing state. In other places, colonization seems to be incomplete, because what you have is still existing, people that have still, they still have control over their land and the sea. So, places in the Western Pacific, you still have these existing, different landowning groups that still have control over their land, and the state does not have ownership of the land. The state, or the modern state, would have to negotiate with the existing, existing landowning groups or structures. But that's different from the case of Hawaii, and it's because of the 1898 disruption. I live just next door to here, and I, every day I walk to my office, Sakamaki, and the Dole Street is actually a reminder of that disruption, that 1898 disruption. All right, the Dole Street, that is the reminder of that. So what's interesting, and I think this is part of the point here, the period from 1890 up to 1900, it's interesting because of the different kinds of legal engineering that was going on. Here in Hawaii, also in the so for instance, for the case of Philippines, the Spanish-American War, and then there was a treaty, the Paris Treaty in 1898, signed between the U.S. and Spain, and that provided the basis for eventual granting of Cuba independence, and Philippines and Guam as territories that would be administered by the United States, the Navy. And then Philippines eventually became an unincorporated territory of the United States in 1902. That was the legal device that sort of gave effect to the disruption in 1898. Right? That was part of the Spanish-American War. But you can see that, if you look at the Philippines, and for the case of Hawaii, there's a clear pathway in terms of the consolidating of empire or the control of the United States. So Philippines, you can see that there's a clear pathway towards independence. Right? By 1947, it became independent. And there's a clear pathway that eventually led to Hawaii became, a state as part of the United States. And that's because of the legal engineering that was going on in the 1890s. I'll stop.
Questions for Joseph before? Count?
So, from what I heard, there was a conflation of Great Britain's constitutional governance, plenary power of Parliament, and the United States Congress. And it appeared that you were kind of making them nearly the same, that by the passing of a joint resolution by Congress, it effectively remedied 1893. I've never seen that argument made. This is my background, right? So I do understand what is the limits of U.S. constitutional law based upon U.S. common law, Supreme Court cases, and also the Lotus case, Turkey, France versus Turkey, right, by the Permanent Court of International Justice, that the foremost rule that prohibits a state is that it cannot exercise any authority in the territory of another state without some permissive rule under customary law or by treaty or convention, right? So dealing with that. So I caught from what you're saying, and I appreciate about the Western Pacific. So it would appear that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Parliament was extending its authority because they viewed the Western islands as non-states.
Yeah, correct, yeah.
So in the case of Hawaii, the United States is dealing with Hawaii as a state, an existing state. In fact, we used to be a British protectorate, 1794, that's why we have the Union Jack on the flag. So we're like Tonga, right? Now, the disruption, yes, it may have started in 1898 that led to American Empire, but I think a contemporary event that would be considered disruption of that narrative would be an action taken by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in the Netherlands back in 1999. So the Permanent Court of Arbitration is an intergovernmental organization to resolve international disputes that was formed in 1899, right? And then followed up by another treaty that reinforced it in 1907. So the contracting states, which included the United States and all the European powers, agreed that they would try to resolve their international disputes by going to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and if they can't resolve it, then they use the rest of the Hague Conventions to regulate the conflict, right? Hague Convention number 4, laws of dealing with war, right, and occupation. But the treaty that formed the court also opens its jurisdiction to non-contracting states, those that did not sign the treaty. And if that's the case, they have to pay for the proceedings, just like a non-member of the UN can access the ICJ, but they got to pay for the proceedings, whereas members of the UN already contribute to the maintenance of the courts. They don't have to pay for the proceedings. But the point is, it's a state issue. I was actually involved I was the lead agent for the legal team representing the Hawaiian Kingdom before the Court of Arbitration. And this was Larson versus Hawaiian Kingdom. And the dispute was the unlawful imposition of American laws, which includes its constitutional system, within the territory of the Hawaiian Kingdom as an occupied state. Before the court could establish an arbitral tribunal to resolve that dispute, they had to make sure that the dispute was international. They had to verify whether or not the Hawaiian Kingdom is a state, and then whether it's a contracting state or a non-contracting state. So I was contacted by the legal counsel, because I was the lead agent for the Hawaiian Kingdom, contacted by the legal counsel for the PCA. And she had to determine whether or not the Permanent Court of Arbitration has jurisdiction or institutional jurisdiction over the dispute to form the tribunal. And she wanted additional information from me with regard to, under international law, has the Hawaiian Kingdom been extinguished by the United States? And the rules of international law would apply to an existing state, not a new state. Okay. And they concluded the Hawaiian Kingdom is a non-contracting state, and the Secretary General reported that in their annual reports. And that is what allowed the formation of the tribunal to resolve the dispute. So that 1999 case at the Permanent Court of Arbitration that lasted 2 years majorly disrupted that narrative that Hawaii was incorporated. And the United States was and is a contracting state to the Permanent Court of Arbitration, and they never disputed that decision. In fact, we were contacted by the American Embassy in The Hague through the Permanent Court of Arbitration if they could have access to all pleadings and records of the case, thus explicitly acknowledging the continuity of the Hawaiian Kingdom and also the government that was representing the Hawaiian Kingdom in these proceedings. So there's a lot that has happened since 1898 that has become disruptive, which also includes, I shared with Lance, the Office of Legal Counsel's legal opinion. That completely disrupts the constitutional narrative that was being utilized back then, but America was driven on empire, so they were disregarding everything and just railroading everything. But yet, when you look at 1898, the only territories that were acquired by the United States by a treaty was Guam, Philippines, and Puerto Rico. Hawaiian Kingdom, joint resolution. And the fact that they say that Texas was acquired by the United States by congressional action, actually no. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, that's what created the Rio Grande as that dividing point, because that was still Mexican territory. And those arguments will actually be made by Representative Ball from Texas in 1898 as to why a joint resolution can't do what it can't do, right? So I appreciate your your narrative, your explanation of the Pacific, because I'm intrigued on how things took place, because in the 19th century, the Pacific looked to the Hawaiian Kingdom as a leader to become, like Tonga, Fiji, you know, Dr. Lawrence Gunship. He's done some excellent research, and he's a political scientist from UH Manoa. He's a good friend of mine. But it disrupts the narrative that we've been led to believe, and that's why I think we need to open the prospect of events that took place, not just within the narrative, but within the narrative that disrupted the narrative. Right? But then that just adds more research that has to be done, but also the application of the right theory. So with regard to state theory that explains all this. Without it, it just doesn't make sense. But I appreciate your presentation.
Thank you for those interventions, and it's very, the Hawaii case here, it's interesting, and there's a lot that the Pacific could learn from the Hawaii experience. And then as you mentioned, from some of the constitution in the Pacific in the 1850s up to the 1890s, as you mentioned, Lawrence actually exposed those examples. But the Tongan Constitution, for instance, or the Samoan Constitution, the Fiji Constitution in the 1870s, were actually modeled following the Hawaiian Constitution in 1864. So you can see that there's a lot of sort of connections during that time. But because of what happened in the 1890s, as part of this disruption, it created this connection.
Good question.
Catherine.
So when you talked about different ways of acquiring these different islands, you talk about conquest. So the people who were conquered, then they just have no rights. How does that work?
Yeah, so two of the ideas in the 19th century that was quite popular, also as part of the British, part of the empire expansion, is the idea of terra nullius. Terra nullius, or an area that's not owned or unoccupied. So the Guam Act of 1856, you can see that it legitimized the concept of terra nullius. All right? Under the Guam Act, it sort of says that, American subjects could claim islands that were not occupied or that were perceived as empty. The other idea that was quite popular in the 19th century was, this idea of nullius imperium, or in other words, there was no government in place. There was no effective government. And those were ideas that were part of that influences how the empire extended, came up with legal devices to try to extend its sovereignty to places in the Pacific. In the Pacific there wasn't, in that conquest it means that you would have an intervention by way of military sort of occupation. But because there were, in many of the places in the Pacific, there were already political institutions that were in place. Some places not centralized, some were centralized. The British, in the Western Pacific, they had to introduce these ideas of legal instruments, such as the Order in Council. So there were a number of orders in council introduced by the British from the 1870s up to 1890 as a way to extend their jurisdiction over the island. But in terms of a conquest or an overthrow of an existing political structure or government, Hawaii is the classic case of that legal engineering asset problem.
All right, thank you so much, Joseph. We're going to turn to our third speaker now, Meagan Harden, who is a PhD candidate in geography and environment here at UH, where her doctoral research focuses on the politics of U.S. island imperialism in the 20th century and the impacts of militarization on islands today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be up here with these absolute legends of Pacific law and history. I think maybe Craig made an accident in inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not actually trained in legal history either. I am a geographer. But I'm going to do my darndest here. So my doctoral dissertation started with an interest in the militarization happening in the Republic of Palau currently. So this is an island chain in the Western Pacific Ocean near the Philippines that's independent, but in free association with the United States. And so as I intended to focus primarily on that militarization, but the more I got into this free association relationship that enables the US to militarize those islands currently, the more I had to go look at these legal histories, this what Dr. Foukona has called legal engineering that the United States as an empire has conducted. So that's kind of how I've come, I guess, to be in this. And I'm going to be talking mostly, we'll talk about the Guano Islands Act and the insular cases, because now I'm obliged to.
Well, you said you were going to
I
talk
know, I was
about
planning to, but then I was so inspired by the last panel that I shifted gears, so now we're back. So we're just playing with it at this point. As a geographer, I find the archipelago a really useful spatial metaphor for thinking about American imperialism and islands, not only because it helps me think about how islands become politically and economically, and in this case, legally oriented around the United States, but also how those same kind of networks of imperialism connect islands to one another. So this is what I was kind of inspired by in the last panel to think more about, is those inter-island relationships kind of decentering the US empire. So we'll go back to 1856, the Guano Islands Act, which Lance and Dr. Foukona have both referenced. This is the kind of first time, or the first legal assertion that the United States makes. They say that US citizens can claim uninhabited islands that contain guano, which is, it's really valuable at the time as a fertilizer. As long as these islands are inhabited, again, that idea of terra nullius, or the doctrine of discovery, they can be claimed on behalf of the United States. What's especially important about this act, though, is that it also says that the United States is under no obligation to maintain sovereignty over those islands once they're no longer useful to the United States. And they do this through the language, or through the phrase appertaining to. They say that these islands can belong to the United States once they're claimed on behalf, but they are not part of the United States. So this is kind of that first legal assertion that islands can be claimed and occupied and exploited by the United States without any permanent obligations to maintain, or or an expectation of permanence, or a reciprocal relationship. I'm going to fast forward to just after 1898, a set of Supreme Court cases collectively known as the insular cases. They take this language of appertaining that's first used in that Guano Islands Act, and they apply it to islands that the United States has claimed since 1898. This time, of course, these are islands that have permanent indigenous populations. So it's using this language of appertaining to say not only that these islands can belong to the United States but not be part of it, but that the people as well are not privy to the protections of the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. The Supreme Court justices deciding these insular cases rely on overt white supremacy to make these cases, and so this is when the categories of unincorporated and incorporated territories first come into law. Importantly, these insular cases are still on the books more than 100 years later. These are the reason that Guahan, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, and then forgetting one territory in the U.S. Virgin Islands, thank you. Why they are still subject to U.S. sovereignty, but not privy to the protections of the Bill of Rights. And I have to clarify, I don't mean to imply that incorporation into the United States is necessarily better. It's still subject to empire. So those are kind of the legal precedents, or the legal categories that play into free association, which is what I'm going to shift gears towards now. World War II happens, to put it in a way, I guess. The United States claims about 200 inhabited islands, 2,000 islands in total, in the in the Pacific Ocean. These are the islands that Japan has been militarized, Imperial Japan has militarized and claimed for decades prior to this, but those are the islands that today we would know as the Republic of Palau, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, as well as the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. So that's Yap, Chuuk, Kosrae, Pohnpei, the Northern Mariana Islands of Saipan, Rota, Tinian, Palau, and the Marshall Islands. So during World War II, the United States occupies, claims these, and the United Nations in 1947 grants the United States administering authority over these islands. So the US is essentially colonizing them, but through this channel of the United Nations. In 1960, the United Nations issues this declaration on granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. So the United States finds itself in this situation where on the one hand it is actively maintaining colonies, and on the other hand it's got this increasing international pressure to formally politically decolonize. And so the UN offers three options for resolving that colonial status. They say places can become independent, they can become incorporated or like subsumed as Hawaii was into the United States, or they can become freely associated with the metropolitan or colonizing power. That free association is really ambiguously defined at the United Nations level. So the United States, of course, starts to think about what that might be. From the United States perspective, they envision free association as, I'm quoting the Secretary of State at the time, Dean Fisk, who says that this is a status short of independence, modeled after Puerto Rico status, which again is an unincorporated territory of the United States. It's subject to US laws and sovereignty, but not protected by them. So I'll leave that there. So the United States starts pursuing this as free association. The three countries that are in free association with the United States today, again, Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia, are independent today, right? So we knew something went funky there from these US kind of imperial motives of maintaining this as a status short of independence. So I'm gonna, inspired by the last panel, thinking about these kind of inter-island or inter-oceanic connections, I want to just sketch out a couple, well, let's say I'll do three examples of the ways in which island peoples from these states and these places in the trust territory that are now in free association with the United States, ways that they used these Western colonial legal institutions, legal practices to claim more independence or to kind of channel, to contour their status to the present day. So first, we've got the Congress of Micronesia, which is like the trust territory-wide legislative entity at the Conference on the Law of the Sea. This is a really exciting, so this takes place, sorry, I'm all over the place, from 1973 to 1982. The Congress of Micronesia pressures the United Nations to let them participate as an observer at this Conference on the Law of the Sea, specifically because they say, as island peoples, ideally on the verge of independence, it's really important to have a stake in how the law of the sea comes to be and how this will work out. What's important here too is that the Congress of Micronesia, again, not yet independent, they're not participating as a state. They join what they call the Oceania Group. So this is comprised of various other states in Oceania advocating for an archipelagic baseline, for more aquatic territory, specifically under the rhetoric of preserving the ocean. So they join with Tonga, Aotearoa, New Zealand, later the Solomon Islands and Fiji to advocate for this. So this is one example of this kind of legal remapping, using those same Western international institutions for the sake of preserving these oceanic identities. The second, I guess, example that I want to give is Palau's nuclear-free constitution. This is a constitution that has also been called an anti-war constitution for various reasons, but I'll focus on the anti-nuclear portion. So this constitution prohibited nuclear materials as well as other chemical harmful materials from transiting through Palau's territorial seas and lands. And they did this specifically looking at the damage that had been wrought on Hiroshima, Nagasaki, on Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, and the memory of destruction that had been wrought by US and Japanese imperialism during World War II. So this is another example of this very Western legal institution of the Constitution being revised, being changed, being utilized for the pursuit of a specifically oceanic interest. And then the third, this is kind of anecdotal, but I think it's really important here in Hawaii to think about, and it's something that's been really impactful for me. Last year, it was in Palau, speaking with folks, and one of the men who was involved in the Palau delegation to the United Nations, who was involved in these status negotiations to eventually obtain independence, was telling me about coming here to Honolulu to meet, to do the negotiations with the US negotiators. He was talking about being down in Waikiki at, I think the Hilton, might have been a different hotel, and encountering Kanaka anti-American occupation protesters or protectors maybe. And telling him, and telling the rest of the delegation, don't sign a contract with the United States, don't let them have any access to your land because they're going to take it, they're going to do the American imperial thing. And so, of course, Palau goes on to sign this compact anyway, but they're able to use that as leverage to get a better deal, essentially, to get more protections than they would have had otherwise, to have an independence that is not this short of independence, Puerto Rico status as an unincorporated territory that's actually independent, has a vote at the United Nations, constrained as that might be. So I guess all of this is to say that I am trying to think through, and maybe we can all think through together, how we can leverage these archipelagic relations that aren't just political or economic, but also legal in terms of how these imperial laws and relationships get replicated and reconfigured over time. How can we use those to disrupt the idea and the pursuit of American hegemony, and then also use legal structures that sustain it? That's all I got.
Thank you so much, Meagan. That was a tremendous amount of legal history in 15 minutes. That was really well done. So, any questions specifically for Meagan, and then I'll open it up for the whole group for any of our comments.
If we wanted an expansion of that, do you have a publication?
I have one paper on the insular cases, and I actually just defended my dissertation last week.
Oh.
So I can send that along as well if anybody's interested. It's got a lot of polishing to do, though.
That would be fantastic.
Thank you.
I just want to compliment you because what ends up happening, we end up being way too siloed. And the fact that you're able to, as a geographer or whatever, you know, I mean, this big title of doctor should actually be in the healing of many different modalities. And I look at doctors, whether they're FUDs or MDs, as opportunities really to see larger issues. So the fact that all of the work during these 2 days has really supported what you're envisioning and also sharing with us, because how would I know any of this other than for you to be very specific and direct? So I just wanted to thank you all, and I haven't heard everyone yet, but just thank you, because it's really helping to clarify for a lot of us huge gaps and huge in terminologies and other things that if we do have the time, I'll go back and look at these legal terms in terms of Latin, what they all mean. I mean, it's really fascinating. So I just want to thank you guys. This is so informative. Thank you all.
So my PhD is in political science. So I specialize in international relations and law. So this is my area, right? And my law articles and publications and everything else. So I just kind of maybe want to just share some ideas that would inform your research, because I totally see where you're coming from, and the importance of terminology is crucial, especially legal issues. So the guano situation, bat or bird doodoo, right, was very rich as far as trade for fertilizer, for all that stuff. The Hawaiian Kingdom didn't utilize the Legislative Assembly to claim items for guano. They actually used the doctrine of discovery. So you had Palmyra being discovered, right? Captain Zent, Captain Patey. They were using the doctrine of discovery as a nation state, but there were no people on it. They were just guano. That was the driving aspect that was happening in the 19th century. Now, when you get into the United Nations in Article 73E of the UN Charter that was dealing with, the territorial possessions of the United States, the crucial term to be understood is non-self-governing, as opposed to self-governing, right? So all the member states of the UN were self-governing, because they were independent states already. But the territories that were not self-governing, or non-self-governing, would exercise a right of self-determination and choose, and that's where you speak to the 3 points. The problem that we have with regard to Hawaii that you mentioned, right? The problem is Hawaii was a nation state. That means it is self-governing, it just doesn't have a government. So to back up in 1893, under customary international law that existed, that was recognized since the Vienna Congress, right, from 1814 to 1819, after the Napoleonic Wars. They all agreed that even though Napoleon overthrew the government, the country still exists. And that was the beginning of customary international law. So by the time we get to 1893, the United States even was recognizing this principle, this customary rule in the Spanish-American War, where even though they overthrew the Cuban government, the government in Cuba, which is Spanish, they didn't have sovereignty there, and they had to begin to continue to administer Spanish law until there was a treaty of peace, which was finally ratified in 1899, but yet they're administering Spanish law in 1898. So what happened in Hawaii was an overthrow of the Hawaiian government, which triggered the law of occupation, where Hawaiian law was supposed to be administered until you get a treaty of peace, right? Now, that didn't happen because Hawaii was wanted by the United States as a military base. That was a driving force from day one. So they're going above and beyond to hide the narrative, right? So when the United States reported in 1946 to the Secretary General under Article 73E of the Charter that Hawaii is a non-self-governing territory along with Guam, Philippines, and Puerto Rico, right? It wasn't. It was still a state. So if you take that and you look at a contemporary example in 1946, right, 1945, the Japanese government was overthrown and a treaty of surrender signed in September 1945. That date, that year, 1945, began the military occupation of Japan, where General MacArthur was administering Japanese law, until a treaty of peace ratified and signed in San Francisco took effect in 1952, where the occupation ended. Japan did not lapse into non-self-governing status, nor did Germany. So how did they put Hawaii there? That was part of the false narrative. And they presented this narrative as if Hawaii chose to be the 50th state exercising self-determination. The problem is, Hawaii is always a state under international law. So only now are we starting to interrogate those events, utilizing state theory, customary international law, custom that has been codified under the 1899 or 1907 Hague regulations, the 1949 Geneva Convention. And I think what I bring to this is not just the poli-sci background. I got 10 years experience in the Army as a field artillery officer. It's all in the field manuals. It says when you occupy territory, sovereignty doesn't transfer to the occupier. It's right there, FM 27-10, right? So how is it that we tend to think that Hawaii is the 50th state? But see, that's why, and I mentioned earlier, what disrupts this whole narrative is the Permanent Court of Arbitration, an international body, verified the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists as a state. These are just ramifications, and it goes against that. So I just kind of, I wanted to inform you of these things so that you can continue your research with your doctoral studies in light of these issues that are already happening. In fact, I have a book is being published this summer out of Oxford University Press. They asked me to write the chapter on the Hawaiian Kingdom. And the name of the book is titled Unconquered States, Non-European Powers in the Age of Imperialism. Lawrence Gunter is wrote the chapter on Tonga. And they have China, Japan, Iran, or Persia, as it was called back then. But the point is, Oxford University Press has already acknowledged Hawaii is an unconquered state. If this was frivolous, I would not have been the author of that chapter and the forthcoming book. So it does disrupt the narrative. So as an academic, it would behoove you to always be mindful of updated information to further inform your research, is the key. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, and I'm looking forward to reading that book.
Can I just fast forward to present day? I know there were stories out earlier to share about the NATO treaty. It doesn't include Hawaii or Guam. I'm just curious what about that? You know, given everything happening with Iran and Israel.
Yeah, Hawaii and Guam and Samoa are not covered by the North Atlantic Treaty.
Right.
Because it's not part of the Atlantic. Of course, neither is Turkey or Hungary, but they're part of the North Atlantic Treaty. So yeah, I think before nobody really ever cared about it or anything, but now when it looks like everybody's about to go to war with everybody, then everybody's like parsing this to like, okay, this isn't included because like we don't want to have to go to war with China because, you know, the US and China are, I mean, that's basically the reason. If China hadn't become a superpower, I don't think anybody would have ever cared whether or not Hawaii was included or not as part of the North Atlantic Treaty. So, I mean, I think that's the practical, the real politic of it.
So just to respond to Catherine and yours, because the Hawaiian Kingdom still exists as a state already verified, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization wouldn't apply to these islands because there's no status of forces agreement for the military to even be here. So again, this is just another example of disrupting the narrative. But I think what the NATO issue was brought up for, that was actually coming from the Russians saying we should make claim to things. And Russian media are saying that Hawaii is not part of NATO, right? Yeah, Hawaii is not part of NATO. There's no legal history that it is. It's just people say it is, like we're saying it's the 50th state, right? But then that's an example of further interrogating and asking the right questions with regard to that, and the fact that, okay, Hawaii as a state, what's the impact or reaction to that statement? Again, that's just another example of asking the right questions. But there needs to be a full understanding of legal status.
Well, I think what I'm saying is I think what I should say is in interpreting the North Atlantic Treaty from the American perspective, you know, basically the US and the other treaty signatories to NATO, they can say whatever they want, and as long as they all agree to it, then as among themselves in their treaty obligations to each other, they can do whatever they want. So whether or not actually, you know, whether or not the Americans accept the fact that, you know, they're basically this is an occupying power, in a treaty with other nation states, they can basically agree or, you know, to any terms that they want to. And I don't think that the Americans excluded Hawaii from NATO because they themselves are willing to legally acknowledge that they're the occupying power, even though that in fact is what is an occurrence. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Is I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying from the American perspective, like, you know, America can say, well, we're excluding Hawaii from this, and the British are saying, oh, we're going to exclude the Falklands and that sort of stuff, and they can agree among themselves that whether or not they actually have lawful control, you know, lawful sovereignty over those places. I mean, that's one of the limitations of treaties, is basically whoever's party to the treaty can say whatever they want as long as they agree to it, then they can basically do it as long as it doesn't affect anything else in the international system. And you know, in terms of NATO, you know, it may have consequences. And I should say also, many people don't understand this, but when a military occupies a place, one of the obligations under international humanitarian law is to establish a provisional civilian government as soon as possible. So just because we don't have military police and provosts basically running the operation here in Hawaii, it doesn't mean that the civilian government that the United States has established here isn't an occupational government. So I just want to clarify that because maybe people don't understand that under international law. So, you know, the Americans can see it one way, but under international law, it can mean something entirely else by just fulfilling these obligations. So I just want to clarify that because people get the misimpression.
I'm really curious.
Governor.
Yeah, I am really curious. I can understand what John was talking about and that level. But just out of curiosity, what motivates a country to sign a treaty that protects the entire country except us?
What?
I mean, I mean, it sounds like, you know, despite the narrative, whatever it is, America didn't care enough for Hawaii. So is that, I mean, is that an example of something ugly?
Well, I think that in one sense, it's like the truth is we're just a coaling station of the U.S. military.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
there's no need to protect a coaling station at any cost. So, I mean, it's a very practical matter. And I don't know if that's the total truth because I don't know the proceedings of how NATO was actually adopted. But I think as a practical matter, nobody's going to defend, you know, nobody's going to sign off and say, well, we're going to defend a coaling station for the U.S. military at any cost. Whereas, you know, bombing Washington, D.C. is in a slightly different category.
And NATO, the United States is a NATO member, right? And I'm assuming that they signed the treaty and all the continental parts of the U.S. is part of that treaty. And those parts that are not on the continent get left outside to defend for themselves. I mean,
Similar to
I'm just following their narrative.
Yeah, so that's why the NATO treaty wasn't triggered when Argentina and the UK in the 80s fought about the Falklands, because the Falklands were also excluded from coverage.
Wow.
So there's got to be a message in there somewhere.
There's multiple messages. There's multiple messages in there.
It's the same message.
Yeah.
So I know we're at noon, but we started a little late, so if we have a couple more questions, I'm sure our panelists would be happy to stay around for a few more minutes, although I know we're heading up on lunch here. Any last thoughts?
I have a question.
Yes.
So, you know, I'm familiar with British judges in the early 19th century in the Caribbean using the idea of jurisdiction and sovereignty, it's like a mouse game of allowing escaped slaves to come into British territory and not recognize their bonded status. And I'm wondering how that type of thinking played into sort of these late 19th century machinations in the Western Pacific.
Yes, so, one of my existing projects or research is on tracing the movement of ideas and colonial practice. So you can see how they move from the Caribbean to the Pacific, or how they move from Africa to the Pacific, or from the Pacific back to Africa to the Caribbean. And you can see these ideas being filtered through with the movement of these different colonial practices, including judges as well. Yeah, so you can see by looking at these different actors and how they move, you can actually see how these ideas, legal ideas and political ideas, move from different cultural boundaries, oceanic boundaries, and how they've been imported and transplanted into the different colonial systems.
Sure, last question.
Last question, do you have a book tracing the movement of those ideas or any publication? You probably already mentioned it.
Yeah, so I'm currently completing a manuscript that looks at this global flow of ideas.
All right, thank you to our three terrific panelists.